player wants to put something, so we have to figure out like where to put something in 3D. So this was this crazy experiment with using some heuristics to figure out where to, like, I'm just, like, the hip goes on the body, okay, that makes sense. You know, the foot can go on the ground, that makes sense. But where do you put the knees when the player grabs them? And so this was an experiment with playing with various heuristics.
There's a surprising amount of heuristics underneath this, an invisible geometry that's trying to resolve the z depth. So basically, the drag apart.
Yeah, so basically, the program here just picks the most right z depth based on some heuristics, and it like worked well enough.
And this is one of those things when it works well, you don't even notice it, and when you put it in front of a 10-year-old, it just kind of behaves the way they expect. But it's not the way Maya works.
So we knew that we had succeeded with this one. Like we grabbed like one of the. We grabbed someone from the team, and then we said, like, sit down with this, use it. What do you think? And they're like, it seems fine to me. We're like, all right, if you don't notice that it sucks, it must be good. See, actually, here's a wacky texture idea that I was thinking, like, what if you had like a bunch of paintbrushes that were sort of like constantly putting things out? I was thinking about the texturing scheme, right? And it was like, well, what if the interface for texturing was you drag these things around that do this sort of color mixing and blending live, and this turns out to be, the problem is hard enough without doing something like this.
Now, a lot of what you're seeing are basically design branches that we pruned that just didn't work out. And so everything that we've done, like in all the design of the game, that actually ends up in the game ends up being maybe 10% of the area that we've actually prototyped.
And then we probably only prototyped about 10% of our ideas, too. So you're looking at a distillation of lots and lots and lots of stuff.
Here's one. Here's a tactile one. Here's one for the cell game. We're trying to figure out what makes a character fun and responsive to control in a game. This is like a very hard problem. I was working with the engineer for cell game, trying to figure out how to make that thing responsive, and also how to make the cells cute. And one of the things we found out that is if we put an eye on the character and the eye follows the mouse really exactly, like every frame, it feels very responsive. And like if we turn that off, turn off the eye. This doesn't feel, I mean, you guys can't feel it because you're not driving it, but it doesn't feel as responsive, also doesn't look as good, but as soon as you turn on this tail, there's more stuff moving, you have the eye following, it just feels much more alive and responsive.
So at any rate, these are some of the prototypes that, a very, very small fraction of all the prototypes that we've done, kind of exploring the game space and the editors and stuff. Now, when we got to the space game, which to me represented where the game really opens up, there are a lot of landmarks. And for me, like, kind of design, a lot of times is driven by landmarks, experiences that I want the player to kind of encounter at some level. And those landmarks, you can interpolate between them and kind of say, okay, what is all the space between these landmarks? And in the space game, there are a lot of narrative landmarks that I really wanted to cover. Grim Fandango was one of my favorite games, and it felt like a really interesting kind of set of landmarks to me, kind of this mixture of the Calaveras figures, these, what is his name, Daddy something, maybe these, Daddy Roth, yeah, and Casablanca. And in fact, those three things mixed together to make Grim Fandango, which is one of my favorite games ever. The space game for me, I had these, favorite sci-fi movies that I really wanted to play out each one of these somewhere in the space game. I wanted the functional aspects, the dynamics of my world that I'm encountering to enable me to do this sort of narrative gameplay. And so that became my kind of early vision for the space game. And as you're playing this game, you're actually coming up through these different levels. And each one kind of represents some type of game genre. The players are making content at each level. But it's very much a goal-directed experience until you get up to the space game, which wanted to open up and feel much more like an open-ended sandbox, more of kind of a Sims or GTA. And so these also, as you're playing each of these meta games, they dive down into the earlier games. So you kind of learn the dynamics of the world at all these different scales that you can now kind of play with in the space game depending on what you want to do. So I want to introduce you to Jenna Chalmers now and just run through, in fact, kind of a lot of her documentation early on of the way the space game was designed. Now, some of the stuff she's going to talk about is stuff that made it in the game or didn't, but you'll get some sense of kind of how she structured this design task.
So the document we're going to race through is basically a very early proposal for what the space game could be, and it was kind of generated by brainstorms from a lot of people on the team. We basically started with, if you could do anything in space, what would you want to do? And we just kind of made a brainstorm list of what are the people's dreams of what they could do in the space game. And then we looked at the games that Will was excited to play that were largely inspired by sci-fi fictions and movies that everyone is kind of iconic with space travel. And We broke those down into a couple meta games, and we decided to focus on those 5 or so meta games and see what we could do if we made a simple space game that encompassed these 5 meta games and was open-ended at the end of an epic game. So we took kind of those core games and we broke down the tools that you would use in those games, and we tried to figure out where we had our biggest bang for buck, and we made a very simple this is artwork. You made a very simple flow chart of the metagames leading to rewards, and it just made a very basic cycle to start the core of our space game from.
And basically, you would, like in this flowchart, you would take the rewards that you earn from these metagames, and then you would reinvest them in the UFO to get better tools. It would enable you to play new metagames, which now start giving you things like missions or specials, etc.
And this is designer art, by the way.
Yeah.
This is not one of the aesthetics that we were debating on the
No,
team.
this is what we expect the game to look like when everyone else starts checking in their content.
Are you guys making fun of my art?
And also, we need, as you encounter all these different types of planets in the space game, each one has certain metagames. You can kind of play on them.
We needed to make sure that we were giving the player, as they flew around, on one hand, the space game is a sandbox where we want the player to have a lot of creativity and a lot of access to do a lot of different things. On the other hand, we have to give them some kind of structure and some kind of gameplay to support their creative drive. So we brainstormed tools and looked at what metagames they supported and focused on the ones that supported a lot of different metagames and tried to think about different ways to use tools. Exploration in space was one of the key things that we had to deliver on. We've talked a lot about pollinated content. Most of you have heard us use pollinated content. The player is exposed to that pollinated content from the creature game on up, but they don't really get a sense of the scope of what is out there until they're in the space game. They're just living on their own planet. They see the other creatures. They see some content in the catalogs, but they don't see, it's at the space level where they have hundreds of thousands of planets that they're visiting that they're seeing vastly different animals than anything they've seen before. They're seeing vehicles and buildings and aesthetics that may be like nothing that was on the home world that they grew their baby character on. So it was very important that the space game deliver this exploration and really